Margaret's mother-in-law sat across from her at the dining table, the one Margaret had refinished herself 3 years ago. Patricia didn't look angry. She looked like someone correcting a clerical error. "We need the house back," Patricia said. "Richard's moving to Portland for the VP role. He'll need somewhere to stay when he visits. You understand." Margaret kept her hands flat on the table. Richard was her brother-in-law. He'd been to this house exactly twice in 8 years. "David's only been gone 4 months," Margaret said. "Which is why we're giving you time. 60 days. That's more than generous." Patricia slid a printed document across the table. "Thomas drew this up. It's just a formality." Thomas was Patricia's eldest son. He was also an attorney, though Margaret had learned he mostly handled corporate contract reviews, not evictions. The document had official letterhead. It used words like occupancy agreement and family estate planning. Margaret didn't touch it. "This house is in David's name," she said. "Was," Patricia corrected. Her tone didn't change. "David's name. And since there's no will, his estate reverts to family assets. Thomas can explain the legal framework if you'd like, but I don't think that helps anyone." Margaret had been married to David for 12 years. They'd bought this house together. She'd paid half the down payment with money from her settlement after her father's manufacturing business was sold. David had covered the mortgage from his income as a regional manager at his family's commercial real estate firm. That was how Patricia had always described it. The family's firm. Not David's job. "I'll need to review this," Margaret said. Patricia stood. She'd already picked up her purse. "Of course. But the timeline doesn't change. Thomas will follow up next week." She left through the front door, the one Margaret had repainted last spring because Patricia had mentioned it looked dated during Easter dinner. Margaret called the probate attorney her neighbor had recommended. His name was Vincent. He had a small office near the courthouse and he answered his own phone. "Do you have the deed?" he asked. She found it in the filing cabinet. David had always handled paperwork, but he'd been meticulous. The deed listed both their names. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. "Then the house is yours," Vincent said. "Automatically. No probate necessary for that asset." "They have a document," Margaret said. "It says the estate reverts to the family." "Did your husband sign anything that contradicts the deed?" She didn't know. David had signed a lot of things. Partnership agreements. Corporate bylaws. He brought documents home from the office sometimes, spreading them across this same table while she made dinner. Vincent asked her to bring everything. Every paper David had signed in the last 5 years. If you've ever had to dig through someone else's filing system after they're gone, you already know how this feels. But stay with me. There's a reason for all of it. Margaret spent 2 days going through the home office. David had kept everything. Client contracts from the firm, tax returns, insurance policies, retirement account statements. There was a folder labeled Family Matters that contained the partnership agreement for Ashford Properties LLC. That was the family firm. David owned 18%. Patricia owned 51%. Thomas owned 22%. Richard owned 9%. There was also a document titled Residential Asset Agreement. It was dated 7 years ago, a month after they'd closed on the house. Margaret didn't remember it. The language was dense, but the core provision was clear. In the event of David's death, the property would be transferred to Ashford Properties LLC for estate consolidation and family legacy preservation. David's signature was at the bottom. There was a space for Margaret's signature. It was blank. She took everything to Vincent. He read the residential agreement twice. Then he set it down and tapped the signature page. "You didn't sign this," he said. "I don't remember seeing it." "Doesn't matter. You're on the deed. This agreement attempts to override a joint tenancy instrument. It can't do that without your consent. He leaned back in his chair. Did anyone ever ask you to sign this? Margaret tried to remember. 7 years ago they just bought the house. David had been stressed about cash flow. The firm had been expanding into a second state and there were capital calls. She remembered him bringing papers home. She remembered him saying it was just clean-up organizational housekeeping. He'd seemed embarrassed to bother her with it. He might have asked, she said. I might have said I'd look at it later. Vincent nodded. Then they have a partially executed document. It's not enforceable. But they think it is. Or they're hoping you don't know the difference. Margaret looked at the agreement again. The letterhead was Ashford Properties. Thomas's name was listed as the drafting attorney. This wasn't a recent scramble. They'd planned this 7 years ago. What do I do? She asked. Nothing, Vincent said. You wait for them to make the next move. If they file anything, we respond. But right now, you're the legal owner. They're the ones with the problem. Thomas called the following Tuesday. He had the same efficient tone as his mother. We need to schedule a walkthrough, he said. For the property. Just to document condition before transfer. There's no transfer, Margaret said. Silence. Then, I'm sorry. I spoke with an attorney. The deed is in my name. The house isn't part of David's estate. Margaret. He said her name like she'd made a simple mistake. I don't know who you consulted, but the residential agreement supersedes the deed. That's basic estate law. If you'd like, I can send you some material that explains. I didn't sign the agreement. Another silence. Longer this time. That's not relevant, Thomas said. David's signature is sufficient for estate purposes. Not according to my attorney. Who's your attorney? She didn't answer. Look, Thomas said. His voice shifted slightly. Less efficient. More careful. I understand this is emotional, but dragging this out won't help. If you force us to file for possession, it's going to cost you more in the long run. Legal fees alone. I'm not leaving. Margaret. She hung up. I know what you're thinking. This seems too clean. But it isn't about the law yet. It's about what people assume you won't challenge. If you've seen it, you know. If you haven't, hit subscribe. This gets more specific. David's memorial service had been in September. Patricia had arranged it. Margaret had sat in the front row of the funeral home chapel while Patricia greeted guests and accepted condolences like a campaign host. People had approached Margaret with the careful sympathy you extend to someone peripheral to the real grief. They'd worked with David. They'd known the family for decades. Margaret had been an accountant before she married David. She'd left her job when they'd started trying for children. That hadn't worked out. By the time they'd stopped trying, she'd been out of the profession for 3 years and David had suggested she focus on the house instead. It needed work. There was always something to fix or update or prepare for the next family gathering. Patricia hosted Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, summer barbecues. Margaret cooked. She set tables. She managed logistics. Patricia would arrive early and rearrange things. Subtly, a centerpiece moved. Place settings adjusted. Small corrections that said, "You're helping, but this is still mine." David never noticed. Or he pretended not to. After the funeral, Patricia had pulled Margaret aside. "You'll want to think about what's next for you," she'd said. "Financially, I mean. David's life insurance goes to the firm, partnership requirement. But there's some savings. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Margaret had nodded. She'd been numb. David had died in a car accident on his way back from a site inspection in Eugene. He'd been 52. They were supposed to have time. Now, 2 months later, she understood what taken care of meant. Thanksgiving arrived. Patricia called the week before. "We're hosting at Thomas's this year," she said. "Given the circumstances." "You always host," Margaret said. It's complicated this year. I'm sure you understand. Margaret understood. She wasn't invited. She spent Thanksgiving alone. She made a small chicken. She ate at the dining table and thought about the residential agreement. David had signed it. That part was real. He'd come home from the office with papers and he'd asked her to sign something and she'd been distracted. Maybe she'd been painting the spare bedroom, maybe she'd been on the phone with her mother, and she'd said later. And he hadn't asked again. Or maybe he had. Maybe she'd refused and forgotten. That possibility sat in her chest like cold water. In December a letter arrived. Not from Thomas. From a law firm in Portland. They represented Ashford Properties LLC in the matter of residential possession, regarding the property located at 428 Maple Terrace. They requested her voluntary vacatur within 30 days. If she failed to comply, they would file for unlawful detainer. Margaret took the letter to Vincent. They're trying to scare you, he said. This firm doesn't even practice in this county. They'd have to retain local counsel to actually file anything. Will they? Depends how committed they are. He set the letter aside. Here's the thing. If they file, it becomes public record. Right now, this is a private family disagreement. Once it's in court, people will ask questions. About the firm. About how they do business. I'm guessing Patricia doesn't want that. So what do I do? Same thing. Nothing. Let them decide if they want this to be a public fight. The firm filed in January. Vincent called to tell her. They're alleging breach of a residential occupancy agreement and seeking immediate possession. The hearing's in 3 weeks. Can they win? Not on the merits. But they're betting you don't want to fight. Court costs money. Takes time. You're alone. They're thinking you'll fold. Margaret felt something shift. Not anger. Something colder. What do I need to do? She asked. Show up. Bring the deed. I'll handle the rest. You already know where this is going. But how it gets there matters. That's why you're still here. Drop a comment if you've ever had to fight for something that was already yours. Changes how you see things. The hearing was in a windowless courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old paper. Margaret sat at a table with Vincent. Across the aisle, Thomas sat with the local attorney named Brennan. Patricia and Richard sat in the gallery behind them. The judge was a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd heard every version of every argument. Brennan went first. He presented the residential agreement. He argued that David's signature created a binding estate obligation. He used phrases like testamentary intent and family asset protection. He made it sound reasonable, inevitable. Vincent stood. He was calm. He didn't argue about intent. Your Honor, Mrs. Ashford is listed on the deed as a joint tenant. The residential agreement requires both signatures to modify that interest. Mrs. Ashford never signed. The agreement is unenforceable. Brennan objected. The deed doesn't negate the estate agreement. This is a matter of contractual succession. There's no contract, Vincent said. Not without her signature. The judge looked at the documents. She took her time. Mr. Brennan, do you have any documentation showing Mrs. Ashford agreed to this arrangement? The deed predates the agreement by only a few weeks. The intent is clear. Intent isn't execution. Do you have her signature? Brennan hesitated. No, Your Honor. The judge set the papers down. Then you don't have an enforceable agreement. Petition denied. It was over in 11 minutes. Margaret walked out of the courthouse ahead of Vincent. Patricia was standing near the elevators. She looked at Margaret like she was seeing her clearly for the first time. This isn't finished, Patricia said. Yes, it is. Thomas appeared beside his mother. We can file an appeal. This is a procedural error, not a ruling on the merits. Thomas. Patricia's voice was quiet, sharp. He stopped talking. She looked at Margaret for a long moment. Then she walked away. Richard followed. Thomas stayed. "You could have worked with us," he said. "This didn't have to be ugly." "You tried to take my house," Margaret said. "We tried to consolidate assets. That's what David would have wanted." "Did you ask him? Or did you just assume he'd sign whatever you put in front of him?" Thomas didn't answer. He turned and left. Vincent appeared at Margaret's side. "You okay?" "Yes." "Good. Because there's one more thing. David's 18% stake in Ashford Properties. According to the partnership agreement, if a partner died without designating a successor, their interest transferred to the surviving general partner. That was Patricia. But if the deceased partner's spouse was listed as a beneficiary in any partnership documentation, they had a 90-day option to claim the interest instead. Margaret had found the designation buried in the onboarding paperwork from when David had joined the firm. It was 20 years old. His handwriting listed Margaret Ashford as primary beneficiary for all partnership interests. She'd shown it to Vincent the day after the hearing. "Do you want it?" he'd asked. She'd thought about it. 18% wasn't control, but it was enough to block major decisions. Enough to require her vote on property sales, capital calls, expansions. Enough to make Patricia call her. "Yes," Margaret had said. The call came on a Thursday. Patricia's voice was measured. "We need to discuss the partnership interest." "There's nothing to discuss. I'm exercising the option." "Margaret, be reasonable. You don't know anything about commercial real estate." "I know how to vote no." Silence. "What do you want?" Patricia asked. Margaret had thought about this. She'd spent weeks thinking about it. "I want the house quit-claimed entirely into my name with no residual claims. I want a formal apology from Thomas for filing a fraudulent petition. And I want you to buy out my partnership interest at fair market value, appraised by an independent third party." "That's excessive." "That's the offer. You have until Monday." She hung up. The buyout closed in March. The appraisal came in higher than Margaret had expected. Ashford Properties had acquired 2 new developments in the last year, and the firm's valuation had increased accordingly. Patricia signed the check herself. She didn't speak. Thomas had sent a written apology. It was one sentence. "I regret any misunderstanding regarding the property petition." It wasn't what Margaret had asked for, but it was notarized and it would do. The quitclaim deed was recorded the same day. Margaret stood in the kitchen of the house that was now, unambiguously, hers. She looked at the table Patricia had sat at 7 months ago. The woman who'd spoken to her like an inconvenient tenant. Margaret thought about David. About the papers he'd brought home. The agreements he'd signed without reading carefully because Thomas had drafted them and Thomas was family, and you trusted family. She thought about the version of herself who'd said later, instead of reading what her husband had put in front of her. The version who'd painted rooms and cooked dinners and let other people make decisions about her life. That version was gone. If you made it this far, you already know the real story isn't about the house. It's about the moment you stop waiting for permission. If that means something to you, let me know in the comments. And if you're wondering what happens when people underestimate you, subscribe. There's more where this came from. Margaret still lives in the house. She repainted the front door. Navy blue this time. Not because anyone suggested it. Because she wanted to. Patricia hosts Thanksgiving at Thomas's house now. Margaret isn't invited. She doesn't mind. Some people say she should have taken the 60 days and left quietly. That dragging family into court was excessive. That David would have wanted her to cooperate. Maybe. But David also signed papers that would have left her homeless. And maybe he didn't understand what he was signing. Or maybe he did and he thought she'd never have to know. It doesn't matter now. The house is hers. The deed is recorded. And every time she sits at the dining table she refinished 3 years ago, She remembers the exact moment Patricia slid that document across the wood and said, "It's just a formality." Some formalities, it turns out, require a signature. Margaret never gave hers. And that made all the